Welcome. We're going to jump right into it. There's a lot of information to cover. This is an update to the Paul Washer video that was posted a few weeks back. Quite a polarizing video. Was scarcely an apathetic response to it. Many people were shocked by it. Many people were upset. A lot of people chose to spew visceral hatred toward me while just disregarding objectively verifiable facts because that's easier than contending with sometimes a harsh reality. Have I now become your enemy because I tell you the truth? So the question is, what do we love? Do we love certain men? Do we love our identity that's wrapped up in a certain group of people? Do we love truth? Do we love what God's word actually says? We're going to jump into all that and pertaining to this update the cross conference that Paul Washer was slated to speak at, but is no longer. His name has been removed from the cross conference website, and I'm going to share with you why, what updates I've received. And related to all that, there's a few others to address. A gentleman by the name of Keith Thompson made a video in response. J.D. Hall of Pulpit and Pen is at it again. For the life of me, I don't know why he's his own worst enemy. And Todd Friel and Phil Johnson did another Too Wretched for Radio podcast addressing this briefly. And again, the same question would apply to them, as does J.D. Hall. I don't know why you're doing what you're doing. It would be an easier thing for you to repent. So you can discredit me, you can discredit the messenger all you want, or attempt to, right? Attack me personally. This is not about vindicating my own personal name. That doesn't interest me. What interests me is truth. Everything I'm dealing with issues here. So you can say, as J.D. Hall does, call me a sectarian minimalist. Somebody commented, I like your tattoo. Did you get it in prison? Real clever. For the record, for the few people that have asked, I don't advocate for tattoos. I'm not about getting tattoos for Jesus. This is an old tattoo I've had for years. All of the tattoos that I do have are old. They were the result of youthful haste and not something that I'm a proponent of at the moment. So if you're a weak Christian and that causes you to stumble, I apologize, but this isn't something that I would ever encourage a young person to do, or an old person for that matter. It's a vain practice that's a bad stewardship of your money and an exercise in worldliness, generally speaking. Not per Leviticus. That is not why I disagree with tattoos. Context is important. That said, I would never advise anybody to get a tattoo. I would advise you to focus on the facts. I would advise you to listen to what I'm saying and judge what I'm saying on its own merits. Again, to quote Paul Washer, what I'm saying, is it true? Right? To point to anything other than the argument is what's known as an ad hominem attack, or an ad hominem fallacious ad hominem argument is an attack against the person rather than the argument itself. I'm dealing with issues here. Now, whatever dirt you think you might have on me, I can assure you I have more, right? I know what my own heart's like, and I'm not proud of it. And hence the reason I'm a Christian to begin with. Nobody knows the depths of my own wicked heart like I do. So I trust me, if you think I'm bad, I know I'm worse. So I would encourage you to let's stick with the facts. That said, if I'm actively practicing something sinful, that's completely different, right? We're always going to have a wicked heart. The question is, how are you walking in the moment? And that's exactly what I'm addressing. Not mere lip service, but actions are important as well. What are you currently doing? If all that was required was saying the right things, then, boy, the Pharisees should have been a no-brainer, right? Outwardly, their righteousness was pretty apparent. So let's get right into this update to Paul Washer, starting with a guy named Keith Thompson. I know very little about who this guy is. He's got a YouTube channel that seems to be primarily videos of Paul Washer that he posts, or he'll post somebody, John Piper versus Paul Washer, or something like this about an issue. So he posts a lot of videos. I can understand why he would be mad. It seems his whole his whole motive is to promote. It's primarily Paul Washer. But here's what he said. Let's jump to this. Oh, that's nice. Nothing's ready. How about it? Here it is.
Hello, brothers and sisters. This is Keith Thompson. I got a inbox message from one of my loyal subscribers. He sent me a link to a video titled "Paul Washer Partners with Hillsong Speakers." I don't know much about this, and this video is not going to be very long, but I just want to give my 2 cents about
Just the first thing to notice, he doesn't know much about this because Keith never watched the video in question.
the situation. Now, I'm looking at the video, and I'm going to go ahead and read the description. It says, Paul Washer is now endorsing and partnering with Hillsong and Jesus Culture speakers.
Okay, so he just reads the description. Let's jump up
Okay.
here.
Once respected and spoke much truth, his compromise and personal favoritism has gone on too long. His compromise and personal favoritism. There has been no compromise, okay, and there is no favoritism. I don't see that anywhere. And I've
Yeah, well, Keith, if you had watched the video, you might have seen it.
been following the man for years.
For the record, so have I. I'd be willing to bet money I've probably listened to more Paul Washer than Keith Thompson has. I don't say this lightly. I'm not embellishing a detail. Probably hundreds of hours, if that's how many hours Paul has put out. I've probably listened to everything he's ever put out, for the record. So if anybody watched that video, you heard me say it was with a heavier heart more than anything that I brought this information. However, my loyalty is to God, it is to His Word, it is to truth first and foremost. Apparently not so with Mr. Thompson. So he's in the business of confirmation bias. He won't listen to it if it threatens whatever his objective is.
Goes on to list Trip Lee, David Platt, Kevin DeYoung, Thabiti, and John Piper as people also being immersed in and partaking in wicked, compromising practices along with Paul Washer. Okay, I'm going to stop there. I'm not going to go any further.
So he's in the business of answering a matter before he even hears it. I'm not going to go any further. Again, he never watched the video. He's read the description, and that's as far as Mr. Thompson's willing to take it.
Listen, we have to be very, 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 very cautious and careful before we start judging based off of affiliations that we perceive to be true.
Well, this isn't a perception, Keith. If you had watched the 59-minute video that I released and peppered with tons of verifiable empirical facts, you would know that these are not perceived, and we'll get into that in just a moment as well. Let's jump ahead here. He
Now,
says,
in situations like this, is this the creator of this channel is Arminianistic in his theology, so he's going to automatically run into a lot of roadblocks when it comes to Reformed biblical teachers.
Keith has no clue what he's talking about. First of all, to assert I'm Arminianistic in my thinking, on what basis does he say that? Merely because I've called Paul Washer out. If he had listened to the video, he would have heard me say that I respect Paul Washer, and then go on to quote Charles Spurgeon and Alexander McLaren. But that's what happens when you answer a matter before you hear it. It is shame and folly to you. Congratulations, Mr. Thompson. You should have watched the video. So now he's gone on to slander me, but it'll get better here in a second.
This is why he's naming people like John Piper, John MacArthur, Paul Washer. Okay, these
No, that's not why, Keith.
men are our modern day Spurgeons, Whitfields. Listen, these are the men who will 50 years from now be read about in books.
He just lumped John Piper in the category with modern day Spurgeon. The same John Piper that says if you that Rick Warren is theological and doctrinal and sound. So apparently Keith Thompson doesn't know much about Mr. Spurgeon either. Let's see what else he had to say.
And in the background, I saw some false teacher. Oh, stay away from John MacArthur. We can't do that. Okay, we cannot do that. These men are going to mingle with and sometimes be in the same areas. Sometimes it can happen where these false teachers may be. And
we're not talking about mingling, first of all, but where does he get this idea from? It's just going to happen. Why? You're not going to find me in a place with Joel Osteen. at some unified religious gathering, partnering on stage together and endorsing and praying with and, on a billboard with. That's what we're talking about. Again, if Mr. Thompson had spent the time to watch the video, he wouldn't be sounding so foolish right now. He then goes on to say this.
Not concerned with who that person might be associated with, because a lot of times these pastors are so concerned and busy with.
He's not concerned with who people are associated with. Well, it sounds like he's not concerned with the Bible, which is only going to be more ironic here in a second. He also says this.
Who they may even. You cannot point me to an article or a sermon where he is clearly teaching heresy. I don't want to. Don't bring it to me. Don't talk to me about he's a false teacher. Okay.
So according to Mr. Thompson, actions are irrelevant. As long as you say the right thing, you can do whatever you want. Don't talk to me if you listen. What he's saying is, as long as you can speak correct soteriology, you can be an adulterer, you can be a reviler, you can be a murderer. He basically ripped 1 Corinthians 5 right out of his Bible and then proceeded to speak about this presumptuously. This is absolutely ridiculous. So Mr. Thompson does not have a biblical worldview. He doesn't even have a Spurgeonistic worldview, and we're going to tackle that in just a second. But then he has this to say.
So this man needs to really. I would not. This guy's off. He's off, and I guarantee you, if you asked him to really explain the gospel, it would be off. It would be off, because there's a reason why he's targeting men like Piper, MacArthur, Vodi Bakum, Paul White.
He can guarantee you that if you ask me about the gospel, I would be off. Well, listen, I'll point you to the About section of a blog page I run, and you'll see the gospel laid out there for you. Why can he guarantee this? Because I said something bad about the people that he likes. He can't guarantee it. At best, this is ignorant. And it's actually slanderous. He doesn't know what he's talking about. He's never bothered to ask me this question, but he guarantees it would be off. Why? Because Mr. Thompson is apparently an emotional person. So rather than sticking with facts, as I said, he didn't even bother to watch the video. He resorts to slander instead. I guarantee you this guy would be off, because who could say something bad about John MacArthur or John Piper? That's called idolatry. That's what that's called. But he goes on to say this.
Sorry, you're not that. Okay, and there's a reason. So I would really ask this man to really question, why are you attacking this man? Why are you attacking Paul Washer? And if there's evidence, provide the evidence.
59 minutes worth of evidence, Keith, was provided. Again, if you had bothered to watch the video, you wouldn't sound so foolish right now.
Okay, don't just sit there and give your opinion. Provide evidence. Okay, because that's one thing I did do with Justin Peters. I showed the proof. Now, I was wrong as to why I thought he was doing that, and I took the video down. I rebuked and corrected myself. Okay, we're commanded, 2 Timothy 4:2. Okay, rebuke, correct, and encourage. Okay, so we have to be humble. We have to be very, very cautious when we call up these preachers. And if you're calling them out, you better have proof. You better have proof, because this is damaging. It really is damaging.
Yeah, Keith just doesn't want to look at the proof because it'll be damaging to his YouTube channel, I suspect. So he resorts to slanderous tactics instead. He then says, trying to find the mark here.
These are the guys you go after? Come on now. We got to be biblical, man.
We got to be biblical, man, says Keith Thompson. We've got to be biblical. Well, Keith, I agree with you. We ought to be biblical. I want to be biblical. I was biblical. Curious, though, in his 5-minute video, Keith didn't quote the Bible once, not even a single time. I left a couple of replies on his underneath his video in the comment section with several scriptures listed. This is nothing new. This has basically been the same response. Most of the negative responses have been just that. No biblical or factual objections, slanderous ad hominem attacks, and just the stench of idolatry. How dare you say this? Listen, I like Paul Washer. I have listened to him. I'm not critiquing him for being a bad father. I'm not critiquing him for using foul language. What I said, was it true? Well, Keith Thompson can't answer that question because he never watched the video. But then he says that Piper and so forth, these guys are the modern day Spurgeons. Well, Mr. Thompson's idolatry runs deep. Let's just see what Mr. Spurgeon had to say about some of this. Let me see here. Okay, Charles Spurgeon. Complicity with error will take from the best of men the power to enter any useful protest against it. Fellowship with known and vital error is participation in sin. Yes, Mr. Thompson, despite your words, Charles Spurgeon says that your action of fellowship with known and vital error is participation in sin. As soon as I saw, or thought I saw, error had become firmly established, I did not deliberate, but quitted the body at once. Since then my counsel has been, come out from among them. I have felt that no protest could be equal to that of distinct separation from known evil. That I might not stultify my testimony, I have cut myself clear of those who err from the faith, and even from those who associate with them. Charles Haddon Spurgeon, The Sword and Trowel. I believe this was from November of 1888. Don't quote me on that, but I'm pretty sure it was on or about that time. This is a whole page full of Spurgeon talking about actions here. The day will come when those who think they can repair a house which has no foundations will see the wisdom in quitting it altogether. All along we have said to come out from association with questionable doctrines is the only possible solution of a difficulty which, however it may be denied, is not to be trifled with by those who are conscious of its terrible reality. But Mr. Thompson says, I don't care who people are associated with. I mean, they don't have time to be doing this. Listen, you can see this website up here. There's several quotes here from Charles Spurgeon. The one that seemed to make the most sense in the moment is him talking about cutting himself clear from not only the person who is sinning, but also the people that are associating with them. So apparently, not only does Mr. Thompson not have a biblical grasp or is biblically illiterate, he's also Spurgeon illiterate. This is the tip of the iceberg on Spurgeon. I just don't have the time to get into all this, but that is the result of blind idolatry. That is the result of emotionalism and sentimentalism. Mr. Thompson is mad that somebody he likes was caught doing something, and he doesn't want to admit it because he loves Paul Washer or any man, whoever it is. John Piper, I can't even believe John Piper's errors are so monstrous at this point, it just baffles me he would mention his name. But I digress. So Mr. Thompson's response is not unlike many responses that I got. People who didn't watch the video because they didn't or don't want to confront reality. Okay, another person who has a tough time with reality would be Mr. J.D. Hall of Pulpit and Pen. So we'll address him just briefly. He wrote another half-baked article about this, about this video. Fact check, is Paul Washer partnering with Hillsong? So, J.D. Hall starts out with background. He goes on for, 5 paragraphs there to just really tout his perceived accolades and tell how awesome he and Pulpit and Pen are. Then who is Servus Christi? So he goes on to lambaste me, questioning what my real name is. Yes, it is Joshua Chavez right here. There's no reason to question that, but JD wants to cast doubt on the source because he can't contend with the facts. Again, he goes on to call me a sectarian minimalist, and if you haven't seen the video that I did, I highly advise you to watch it here. J.D. Hall, Pulpit and Pen founder, says John MacArthur is wrong. I mean, listen, basically everything that J.D. Hall said in this new article, he said in the last one. His tune hasn't changed, and all of that in this hour-and-a-half presentation has been so thoroughly refuted. I pity the guy at this point. It's just ridiculous. But anyway, J.D. Hall says, who is Servus Christi? What is his malfunction? Right? He's really focused on me, right? And then when he attempts to get at the issue, let's start here. So he says, in other words, his logic works like this. Bill Johnson of Bethel Redding is bad. Francis Chan greets Bill Johnson warmly, therefore Francis Chan is as bad and the same as Bill Johnson. Kevin DeYoung greets Francis Chan warmly, therefore Kevin DeYoung is as bad and the same as Bill Johnson. John MacArthur greets Kevin DeYoung warmly, therefore John MacArthur is as bad and the same as Bill Johnson. Paul Washer greets John MacArthur warmly, therefore Paul Washer is as bad and the same as Bill Johnson. Servus Christi fails to realize, I'm presuming, okay, so anyway, this is his characterization of the argument, which is a straw man argument. It's absolutely ridiculous. You're going to hear Todd Friel do the same nonsensical thing that he's been doing. They've just changed, they were calling it the 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon before, and they realized how silly that sounded after probably the last presentation. So this is his characterization. Well, that's not at all what happened in the video. I didn't talk about Paul Washer's affiliation with John MacArthur at all. I talked about him partnering with Thabiti Anyabwile and Trip Lee and John Piper and Kevin DeYoung and these immediate people. So he adds extra degrees because it looks better for him. And here's what J.D. Hall said, and you could, like I said, watch the video when you have time, but here's what J.D. Hall says in his own words.
Well, we agree on 1 John 2, right?
Yeah, but I'm asking you for clarification. Why would that be sinful for me?
Because that's taking part in his wicked works. We agree on the second degree of separation.
Okay, so if somebody said,
we might even agree on, hold on a second, we may even agree, depending upon the severity,
right,
of 5 degrees of separation. I'm not hypothetically against it.
So J.D. Hall agrees with 5 degrees of separation, and it's just funny because here's Bill Johnson, Francis Chan, Kevin DeYoung, John MacArthur, Paul Washer. Well, there's the 5 that he put up there. According to J.D. Hall's own words, he agrees with 5 degrees of separation. He's not hypothetically against it. Again, if you go back and watch this video, you will hear J.D. Hall's ever-vacillating opinion for an hour and a half of what just becomes bizarre at some point. I don't know if the guy has a disorder, but it sure seems like it. He exhibits characteristics of a narcissist, and I'm talking about clinical narcissism here. I can't say as a statement of fact that is the case. It definitely seems to be the case. But anyway, he goes on to say, okay. Is Paul Washer partnering with or endorsing Hillsong? Finally, he gets to what's supposed to be the article. He spends the last couple paragraphs actually addressing the article. And he says, right here, the answer is no. Accepting an invitation to speak at an event is not the same as partnering or endorsing that individual unless you're the one planning the event and putting it together, or unless there's an actual explicit statement of endorsement like the kind Francis Chan or Ronnie Floyd gave to IHOP. Well, first of all, J.D. Hall's standard is arbitrary. Second of all, it contradicts himself. Yet again, let's just listen to what J.D. Hall himself has to say.
Southern Baptists considered Ronnie Floyd's presence at the International House of Prayer as an endorsement. So when they went to the charismatic event, they said, Ronnie Floyd is here. How bad could it be? So Southern Baptist lay people saw it as an endorsement, even though when Ronnie Floyd went to the microphone, he said, this isn't an endorsement. No one heard that because you're there with the applause and the aplomb and with the Pomp and circumstance. You're there celebrating with them. No one hears you say this isn't an endorsement. All they see is you on stage. So it is what we call a tacit endorsement. Secondly, Roman Catholics considered Ronnie Floyd's presence an endorsement. They had a Catholic track. So it wasn't just charismatic. It was Roman Catholic. They had a Catholic track because they're all into contemplative prayer and hearing direct divine revelation from God. They also deny sola scriptura. And so Catholics and charismatics go together like butter and bread. We wrote about that in a different post. Jeff Maples wrote about it, in which the Roman Catholics were excited that, quote, unity has come across denominational lines, pointing out that Ronnie Floyd was speaking there. So the Roman Catholics saw it as a sign of unity. They saw it as an endorsement regardless of what came out of his mouth. Charismatics also considered Ronnie Floyd's presence an endorsement. Even though oneness Pentecostals were there taking part in what Ronnie Floyd was doing at IHOP, they all celebrated the unity through the tacit endorsement of Ronnie Floyd. So you have Roman Catholics considering it an endorsement, Southern Baptists considering it an endorsement, Charismatics considering it an endorsement. And so we say, listen, there has to be division between those who belong to God and those who are belonging to cults. You have to be separate, because what business does the temple of God have with a house of idols? This is called syncretism. This is condemned. This is like worshiping Jehovah in the presence of an Asherah pole, or worshiping Baal at the same time you're worshiping Yahweh. It ought not be.
So a couple things to address. First of all, J.D. Hall either is ignorant of what Ronnie Floyd said or deliberately lied. I suspect the latter, given his habitual tendency to do so. Ronnie Floyd, according to J.D. Hall in this article, said this: unless there is an actual explicit statement of endorsement like the one Ronnie Floyd gave to IHOP. Yet, in his own podcast, he acknowledges that Ronnie Floyd did exactly the opposite. He explicitly stated he was not endorsing them, and yet J.D. Hall still said it's what we call a tacit endorsements. Despite the fact that Ronnie Floyd said, I'm not here to endorse you, J.D. Hall compares his being there to worshiping Baal at the same time he's worshiping Yahweh. So which one is it, J.D.? You don't know what he said, or you're a liar? Which one is it? You're ignorant or you're a liar? I'd like to know. You seem to be in the habit of confusion. This is just a perpetual state for Mr. Hall. So much so that I could only advise anybody that's under this guy's leadership to get out from under it immediately. Absolutely bizarre. So Ronnie Floyd not only didn't give an explicit statement of endorsement, he explicitly said, I'm not endorsing you. And yet, and correctly, I might add, I agree with J.D. Hall on his assessment in his podcast. His being there is a tacit endorsement. It was a tacit endorsement. Despite his words, his actions undermined them and gave the clear appearance to everybody else that I'm here. His actions were the proof in the pudding, so to speak. So J.D. Hall made a correct assessment when it didn't have anything to do with his guy, his platform, or his circle of influence. And that's the problem. J.D. Hall is in the business of business. If you go to his Facebook page, you can buy a John Calvin t-shirt. He's in merchandising. That's what this guy's up to. He sells t-shirts on the side. But I could imagine even Calvin himself probably didn't sell t-shirts. Can you imagine John Wesley selling holiness t-shirts? Absolutely ridiculous. But that's what these clowns are all about. And I'm not using this in a merely derogatory sense. This is clownish behavior. That's the nicest thing I can say about this. It's repulsive. It is the antithesis of all things biblical. Not only are you lying and misleading people, or at best misleading people in your ignorance, at worst and more likely lying about it, but everything you do is crafted to present some image and to build your little kingdom. Merchandising? You got to be kidding me. I'll come buy a John Calvin t-shirt at the Polemics Report. This is a joke. So anyway, Ronnie Floyd did give a tacit endorsement of IHOP, even though he explicitly said, I am not here to endorse you. Again, J.D. Hall doesn't know what he's talking about. I implore you to go watch the video that I already did covering all of this. But let's move on. Wretched Radio, Too Wretched for Radio, Todd Friel and Phil Johnson are at it again as well. Let's just listen to their 2-minute introduction about their assessment of this Paul Washer video. Here's what they say.
He also talked about degrees of separation. By the way, Paul Washer's a heretic now. I don't know if you caught that video out on the internet. The same guy who said you and I were heretics.
I did see it.
Now Paul Washer.
Well, I'm glad to be in the same class as Paul Washer.
Yeah, because here's what happened. This is how the guy makes the case. Paul Washer once went to a conference, and everybody at the conference that he spoke to were actually sound in their theology, but he was on the same airplane as a false teacher. That false teacher knows a fellow in Cleveland who's married to the second cousin of guess who? Paul Washer. There you have it. Paul Washer's a heretic. I think that's how he made the case. It was so ridiculous because, Phil, you're double-minded because you claim that Michael Brown shouldn't be associating with the NAR guys and defending them the way that he does. But you know John MacArthur, who once did a conference with John Piper, who once did a conference with Francis Chan, who did a conference with Mike Bickle. Therefore, you're a heretic. Unbelievable. Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I saw that Paul Washer video. I mean, the one where he's labeling Paul Washer a heretic. And I watched maybe 6 minutes of it, which was way more than I should have spent any time. And I kept waiting for him to come to the point.
I know.
What is it that Paul Washer has done that has made you publish this video with the big headline that, brands him a heretic? And 6 minutes in, he still hadn't really got to it. And he was saying a lot of things that sounded ominous and sinister, but he hadn't really explained yet how Paul Washer had sinned. And I figured, he's never going to get around to anything concrete. I just turned it off.
Yeah, I know. You're a better man than I. I couldn't do 60 seconds.
So it seems Mr. Thompson, Keith Thompson, took a page right out of Phil and Todd's book and answered a matter before he heard it, just like they did. Phil Johnson says he got 6 minutes through. He watched 10% of a video and then tries to give an opinion, some assessment as if it's an informed one. Todd Friel dropped the ball completely and said he couldn't even make it 60 seconds. Couldn't even make it a minute into the presentation. Yet, if that's true, Todd, I want to know how you could characterize the argument at all. If you didn't watch any of the video, where did you come up with this he jumps on a plane to Cleveland and he knew somebody's cousin's brother's uncle's second, twice removed? This is all dismissive and deliberately so. Because they're friends with Paul Washer. Paul Washer spoke at the Shepherds Conference the last couple years. Todd Friel and Phil Johnson partner with him routinely. This is personal favoritism 101. They're refusing to acknowledge facts because they don't like it's only going to get more bizarre. They don't like the ramifications of it. So the argument that he made was absurd and on purpose. Well, Paul Washer once knew somebody who, that's not what the argument was. And of course, how would Todd even know that? He didn't bother to watch the video, and Phil got 6 minutes in before he decided he didn't want to hear anymore, because he can't contend with the facts. So that's why they trivialize it and make it sound absolutely absurd. However, I'm saying nothing different than what they're going to say less than 60 seconds later. I couldn't believe my ears as I listened to them make these arguments, because they're still talking about Michael Brown and the stuff that he's doing, right? And despite his orthodox speech, his actions are problematic. So let's hear what Phil and Todd have to say about Michael Brown.
Phil, this is my take on it, having listened to it with Michael Brown, because he's been such a conundrum to me, because he's orthodox on, well, I don't know anything where he's not orthodox. Do you?
I mean, it depends on what you mean by that. I think he would subscribe to an orthodox creed. He would sign off on,
yes,
right, a doctrinal statement that I could approve. When I hear him teach, though, and hear some of the things he says and some of the things he refuses to criticize, I think, wow, this guy it's like he's standing at the door of the sheepfold inviting the wolves in, and it drives me crazy.
I agree with you totally in that regard.
Interesting. Phil says that despite hearing good things, he's upset with the things that Michael Brown refuses to criticize. That is precisely the argument I made concerning Paul Washer. I didn't critique him for what he said. I critiqued him for what he refused to say. And even in the first 6 minutes, Phil Johnson should have seen enough to know that I opened with 1 Samuel chapter 3, verse 13, and Eli looking away from the error of his sons, or not doing enough to thwart their sin. He even said something about it. Yet the Lord pronounces judgment on Eli because it was in his power to restrain them, and he didn't do it. It's what he refused to do. That was precisely my argument. I'm saying nothing different. The consummate hypocrites are at it again. But let's listen to their next clip.
Okay, why is he like that? Because he defends the worst of the worst by basically pulling the card. Well, I don't listen to all their sermons. I'm not supposed, I wrote a book about it that had no teeth, that didn't name names, and then he embraces the very people that he's supposedly criticizing, like Joseph Prince. And so I tried to figure out what it was. So here's as best I can tell with Michael, that he's got just a gaping blind spot regarding his movement. That it's just he couldn't criticize it because of his relationship to it, his relationships with those people that I'm sure that he loves, and he's just blind in that area of discernment. Is that a possibility?
It is, but I think in his case you have to say it's a willful blindness. It's not as if he's never. I mean, the classic thing was when he went on Benny Hinn's program, and even some of his best friends told him that's not a wise move, and he played the same act of I don't really know what Benny Hinn teaches. I don't have time to watch all that.
Couple of things. Number one, that's exactly what Todd and Phil are doing. Because of their relationships, because of their partnerships, because of the people around them that they love, they're refusing to address this error. They're critiquing Michael Brown for personal favoritism while engaging in exactly the same thing. Then Phil Johnson goes on to critique him and say, then Michael Brown plays this card where he says, I don't have time to look into these things. He just refuses to look into these things. Well, when I brought up David Platt and his involvement with Francis Chan, that is the exact argument that Todd Friel used on David Platt's behalf. Well, David's a busy guy. He probably doesn't know what's going on, and, maybe we need to give these. So he's extending a level of grace to David Platt that they're unwilling to extend to Michael Brown. Why is that? Because they're hypocrites. Simple as that. I don't know the exact reason. I suspect it has everything to do with their Calvinist theology. Right? I mentioned this in the last point. The only thing I can see differentiating Michael Brown and what he's doing and John Piper and what he's doing is a different theological persuasion. That's it. Which is not my area of critique. Somebody said I'm Arminianistic in my thinking. I'm not Calvinistic in my thinking. That doesn't mean I'm Arminianistic in my thinking, but I guess it takes somebody with no historical or theological background to not know those are not the only two options. We'll get to that later. They don't extend the same grace because they're protecting their relationships. They're protecting the people around them. Consummate hypocrisy. Okay, clip number 4.
On the one hand, he claims to be a spokesman for and an expert about the charismatic movement, and he's critical of anyone who criticizes the charismatic movement. But when it comes to specific false teachers and their errors, it's always, I don't have time to watch all that stuff. I don't know what you're talking about. I don't think that even exists. And it's a willful blindness. He has deliberately closed his eyes to anything that is critical of the broad charismatic movement. And he writes for Charisma magazine, which promotes the most bizarre and outlandish heresies, and yet he says he doesn't notice these things, but he'll notice it if you whisper a word of complaint about the charismatic movement. Critical.
Yeah.
Wow. So I whisper a word of complaint about the Reformed cessationist movement, and they noticed it. They're doing exactly the same thing. Oh, he just refuses. It's a willful blindness. You're right, Phil, and you're every bit as willfully blind. Both you and Todd. You're blind to your own movement. It's again, personal favoritism 101. They go on to develop this just a little bit.
He could speak so articulately against these guys and the excesses
right.
and the glory glitter and all of the nonsense. He could be so helpful, and yet he's just the opposite.
Yeah, and like I said, he's not an ignorant man. He clearly has the capacity to be a student and a critic and all of that. If he would just talk to the critics and hear what they have to say and interact with that, even if he was still defending the charismatic movement, I'd be much happier with that than the constant, dumb routine. Well, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't believe that exists. You can't. It closes off the possibility of dialogue.
And on the other hand, he then speaks as an expert on the movement, but then slaps down
right.
I'm not sure about that card, even when it comes to my own faith statement.
Well, it looks like we got a few people playing the dumb routine, don't we? I'll just use Phil Johnson's terminology. Phil Johnson says it's a dumb routine that Michael's playing when he claims to not know what's going on here. Well, Phil Johnson and Todd Friel are playing quite a dumb routine themselves, and so is J.D. Hall and their whole camp. When errors in their camp are pointed out, they play dumb. Well, that's just crazy. That couldn't happen. I mean, I didn't even watch 60 seconds of it. You're a better man than me. 6 minutes. I didn't even make it 60 seconds. They're happy. They're reveling in their ignorance and doing the same dumb thing that Michael Brown is doing. They refuse to engage their critics. Somebody says a critical word, and they shut off all dialogue. The very thing, I exposed all of this in the last a couple of videos ago. Watch this one here. Grace to you and Wretched Radio do not want you to see this. I spent exclusive time for an hour and 28 minutes here tackling that. There's another video right here. Grace to you exposed. Phil Johnson and Todd Friel examined, where you can hear more on all of this. They're doing exactly the same thing. It's just bizarre that they don't see it. And Phil Johnson's right. It is a willful blindness. You have to be deliberately, willfully blind to overlook these sort of glaring inconsistencies. Then, and here's one of the things that they said about Michael Brown, the exact same thing that I'm talking about concerning John MacArthur, concerning them. This is why I don't like it. All of this applies to them as well, right? They're refusing to say things about the people that John MacArthur partners with on a regular basis: Tabidi Anabwile, Matt Chandler, David Platt, John Piper, all right, Kevin DeYoung, C.J. Mahaney, Ligon Duncan. Just did a video a couple weeks back that highlighted all of these partnerships with Gospel Coalition members. But here's what they say about Michael Brown.
He defends all of these extremes. And so, it seems inconsistent to me for him to claim that we paint with too broad of a brush because we lump him in with the very people that he often affirms and appears side by side with.
That's a question I want to ask you with Michael. Do we lump him in, or is Michael a clear-thinking charismatic who happens to affirm some of this kookiness, or is Dr. Michael Brown right in the middle of it?
He's right in the middle of it, and he has been for a long time. Yeah, and
he is right in the middle of it, it seems. He's appearing with all of these folks. It's not that he just endorsed Benny Hinn. He participates in conferences with these folks. So I don't think that he's like, well, I'm giving a pat, hey, I know these guys, they're good people. It seems to me Michael is these people.
Right.
He participates in conferences with them. Exactly the thing that I brought up concerning Paul Washer which even in the first 6 minutes was apparent to Phil, because within the 6-minute mark, I did show the cross-conference website and Paul Washer's face with all these other people. And they make this at the beginning. You heard Todd Friel say, one time Paul Washer spoke at a conference, and everybody who was there was sound in their theology, but because he knew it, okay, let's stop right there. This needs to be addressed. If their contention, Phil Johnson and Todd Friel's contention, is that everybody that spoke or is speaking at the cross conference is sound in their theology, we'll go here to the updated list, among whom are John Piper, Tripoli, and Tabidi Anabwile. There's David Platt, Kevin DeYoung, and some others. Let's just take Tabidi Anabwile here. Their contention is that Tabidi Anabwile is sound, right? This guy's sound in his theology. He's a good guy. I got a big question for you, fellas. If Tabidi Anabwile is sound in his theology, he's a good guy, he's a brother in the Lord, I wonder why J.D. Hall and Pulpit and Penn call him a black nationalist, a Marxist, a racist, and somebody to stay away from. Because one of two things is the case. Either J.D. Hall is slandering him and lying, or he's not. So which one is it? Are you willing to critique J.D. Hall for slandering a brother in the Lord? It's either that or Tabidi Anabwile shouldn't be endorsed. So which one is it? He is a sound brother in the Lord with good theology, or he isn't? Because if he is, and J.D. Hall is saying those bad things about him, I wonder why you guys aren't publicly rebuking J.D. Hall. Why wouldn't you tell J.D. Hall, stop slandering our brother Tabidi Anabwile? He is a sound brother in the Lord. We love him, and there's nothing wrong with him. Something's happening here. One of you is lying. Who is it? Is J.D. Hall right, or are you right? And if you're right and Tabidi's sound, you have an obligation to rebuke J.D. Hall publicly. Given that Phil Johnson and J.D. Hall are good friends, according to J.D., Phil Johnson and he speak 1 or 2 times a week, and Phil Johnson, his wife, quilts J.D. Hall's receiving blankets for his children. He says they're very close. Given that you're that close, you're that personal, why wouldn't you publicly be addressing this and saying, hey, listen, you need to stop coming against our brother Tabidi. That's slanderous. That's a slanderous accusation. Yeah, he's not saying that for a reason, right? There's a big glaring contradiction here. Either I'm right or J.D. Hall's right. And if Phil Johnson refuses to rebuke J.D. Hall for what he's saying about Tabidi Anabwile, which I actually agree with, Tabidi Anabwile is a problem. That's what I'm saying. If he's correct in that assessment, then I'm correct in my assessment. And if I'm not correct in my assessment, then Phil Johnson and Todd Friel have an obligation to rebuke J.D. Hall. Will they do it? No, it'll never happen. It'll never happen. Why? Because they're hypocrites. They specialize in personal favoritism. See the last video on John MacArthur and the Gospel Coalition. This is nothing new. John MacArthur's been partnering with these guys for many years. But the crux of the matter is this. This is what my argument has been, and this is what they rightly critique Michael Brown for.
When I hear him teach, though, and hear some of the things he says and some of the things he refuses to criticize, I think, wow, this guy it's like he's standing at the door of the sheepfold inviting the wolves in, and it drives me crazy.
I agree with you totally in that regard.
That's the problem. It's what you refuse to say. Everything they're saying about Michael Brown is exactly what I'm applying to John MacArthur, to Paul Washer, and to them, and they don't like it. Let's jump into this update with Paul Washer and the cross conference, which you can see here. Cross Conference has updated their website and taken Paul Washer's name off. You can no longer see him here. This is the 2019 conference. He was on last time about let's say 2 weeks after the video was posted. His name was unposted. I contacted the Cross Conference to ask them why, what happened. I wanted some verifiable reason as to why rather than speculating, and here's what the Cross Conference said. May 16th here. Cross Conference responds, due to health concerns, Paul Washer is no longer able to join us for Cross 19. Please pray with us that he would have a full measure of health in the coming days. So the number one objection that I received on that video about Paul Washer was this. He hasn't even spoken yet. You need to wait and let him speak. He's going to give another shocking message. He's going to rebuke them, right? They wouldn't say this if I wasn't making a valid point about who Tripoli was partnering with, who John Piper was partnering with, and Tabidi Anabwile and Kevin DeYoung, what these men were doing and who they were partnering with. If there was no validity to that, they would say, what are you even talking about? What they said was, just wait, he's not necessarily partnering with them. The fact that they were trying to give him an excuse proves that they're acknowledging there is a problem, but they're not willing to acknowledge that he's participating in that problem. They're only saying, you're calling it too soon. You need to give him some time. Let's see how the conference plays out. Maybe he's going to rebuke them. The people that say that, who claim to be people who follow Paul Washer, I can tell don't follow him at all. Because anybody who's listened to Paul Washer for a while knows that he has outspokenly endorsed these people for quite some time. This conference is merely a formality. However, now that he's no longer slated to speak there, the video still stands. He's not removed from the conference because of doctrinal disagreement, practical disagreement, or any theological disagreement. It's health concerns. So principally, theologically, he is still in agreement with these people. He was removed for a completely different reason. He didn't remove himself according to the Cross Conference, unless they're lying, in which case Paul Washer has an obligation to publicly address this. They have an obligation. He has an obligation to address this. But since he's not, he is still principally in line with them. Somebody started a fake account and contacted me via Facebook as Paul Washer, claiming to be Paul David Washer. I don't know what their motives were. The conversation didn't last too long before they deleted the fake account on Messenger. That is the low that this group is willing to stoop to. This wasn't some random atheist troll, as people speculate. Somebody who saw a comment that I posted on Paul Washer's page, somebody who follows him, who knew what this video was all about, tried to contact me saying, where are you from? Pretending to be Paul Washer. I knew immediately that I was 99% sure it wasn't Paul Washer. Some of the things they said, the Lord told me this, and things I've never heard Paul Washer say. And that's, again, this is the conundrum for me is, I don't know how many times I have to tell you, I've listened to the man. I used to recommend the man quite frequently, quite with a lot of esteem, right? I'm saying this because it's true, not because I like it, not because it's palatable. I don't take cough medicine because I enjoy the taste. I take it because I have a cough, right? Nobody takes medicine because it's fun to do it. I'm saying this because it's true, and you're going to pick this leaven up. And if my loyalty is to Christ, and truly, I suspect even Paul Washer would and has said this before, truly, if my knee is bowed to Christ and Christ alone, I will bow to nobody else. If I had nothing to say, I wouldn't be saying it. But I do have something to say because there's evidence of it. So the number one objection was, listen, you got to give Paul Washer time to address this because we don't know what he's going to say. So let's just start with Paul Washer's words a few years back in a Q&A session. This is what he has to say about Tripoli and Lecrae. Listen carefully.
Yeah, what are your views on like Christian rap and Christian rock?
Lecrae and Tripoli are both friends of mine. Now you really think I'm cool, don't you? But I consider it an honor for them to be my friends, not because they're rappers, but because they really seek to be men of God. And they are. They walk in integrity. But if they were here right now, they would tell you what they do is extremely dangerous.
So Paul Washer affirms that Tripoli and Lecrae are both his friends. He counts it an honor for them to be his friends. They walk in integrity, and then acknowledges what they do is very dangerous. So dangerous that, as of a couple years ago, here's Lecrae on the top right corner, Tripoli down here, partnering in this big ecumenical gathering called Fill the Mall 2016 that was organized by Nick Hall, the ecumenist here. Took a special trip to the Vatican to greet Pope Francis with a kiss, and Pope Francis gave the opening invitation for this event. Now, given the fact that Tripoli and Lecrae are Paul Washer's friends, and he has endorsed them already prior to the Cross Conference, prior to this conference that he's not going to speak at anymore, which Tripoli still is, and John Piper, Paul Washer has an obligation to repudiate those endorsements on the same public platform that he espoused them. He pointed people in the direction of Lecrae and Tripoli and called them friends. And if his friends are participating in gross ecumenism, why is Paul Washer refusing to criticize them? Just like Michael Brown refuses to criticize the hyper-charismatic extremists in his camp. Phil Johnson and Todd Friel were right to say that Michael Brown is wrong for that. And so am I in saying Paul Washer is wrong for not critiquing them. Here's Paul Washer's friend, the person he counts it an honor to be a friend with, Trip Lee, partners with Hillsong United at Willow Creek Church with the now infamous Bill Hybels, who's been a problem and a rat from the beginning. Him and Rick Warren were partners from the start, and two of the progenitors of the modern seeker-sensitive, purpose-driven movement. So here's Trip Lee partnering with Hillsong United at Willow Creek Church. The same Hillsong United under the authority of Brian Houston, who says Christians and Muslims serve the same God. The same Hillsong United that invites to its conferences Joel Osteen, T.D. Jakes, Joyce Meyer, etc. You want to talk about worst of the worst? This is what Trip Lee endorses, and Paul Washer remains silent after he says, "These are my friends." This was a big event. Let's see if I can zoom in on this maybe. A couple years back, the Big Church Day Out. Bethel music from Bill Johnson's heretical Bethel Church in Redding, California, as well as Jesus Culture. Israel Houghton, who sings at Joel Osteen's church often. And there's Lecrae. Matt Maher's a Catholic. I don't even know who half of these other people are. This is routine. This is routine for Lecrae and Trip Lee. Here's this guy, the Vigilant Christian. Apparently, he commented on Keith Thompson's video about the Paul Washer thing, thanking Keith Thompson for his nonsensical, emotional, and factually baseless critique of the Paul Washer video, because he too likes Paul Washer. Well, I can empathize with that. While I can empathize with hearing good things from him in the past, what I can't empathize with is this and the irony in it. So listen to what he says about Lecrae.
All right, hey everyone, it's TVC Mario, and you're here for a video I needed to make to go ahead and warn my brothers and sisters in the Lord concerning Lecrae. I've done this in many previous videos, so if you haven't seen those, I'll go ahead and link them in the description section below. But what I've been highlighting here is that rapper Lecrae, who, by the way, I was a huge fan of when I first came to the Lord Jesus Christ. It was his Rebel album that glorified the name of Jesus Christ 38 times in it that really helped establish my faith and inspire me and grow me in the Lord. But even me, a fan of Lecrae, here today, I can't stand behind him. If you do, it's idolatry. You idolize him. You cannot draw the line in the sand when it comes to man and God. You're choosing man over God. Here in this video, we...
hard to believe even what I just heard there. And he's right. He's absolutely right in that assessment. If you still choose to support Lecrae, it's idolatry. You idolize him. Yet, his response to Keith Thompson was, "Thanks, brother, for addressing this." He didn't bother to address the facts or to listen to what I had to say about Paul Washer. Why? Because he idolizes him. right? This is exactly what I said about Paul Washer. I like the guy. I used to listen to him. I used to recommend him. What I'm telling you is true. Just like what he's telling you about Lecrae is true. There's Lecrae, how is his video titled, Shouting Out Beyonce and Eminem? This is the tip of the iceberg. Just to touch on who this guy is, the vigilant Christian, while this particular assessment is true, his whole shtick, basically his entire presence is rooted in hyper-conspiratorial Illuminati conspiracy theories. Half of his videos have to do with why the Illuminati sacrificed Robin Williams and Whitney Houston. And this guy is all over the place in several ways I don't have time to get into. So while this particular critique might be true, hardly a guy that seems to have a strong theological background, given his utterly speculative and borderline insane talk about Illuminati conspiracy theories. Listen, everything is not a plot of the Jesuits. Everything is not a plot of the Illuminati. I'm not even discounting certain aspects of legitimacy in those conversations pertaining to groups and societies. There are things such as Freemasons. The Freemasonic Lodge is real, right? The Jesuits are real. They are a counter-Reformation group that seek to infiltrate and destroy from within in Trojan horse style. There's truth to that. However, his presentations are usually not rooted in truth. They're rooted in speculation, right? Well, why they killed Robin Williams. All of this guy's a clickbait guru. I mean, his whole thing is how to get crazy views for his channel, talking about just really exciting stuff. Anyway, he's right about this, though. And if you continue to support Lecrae, it's idolatry. Well, given Paul Washer's stature as a teacher, the fact that he recommended them as friends, he counts it an honor, why is Paul Washer not publicly repudiating those endorsements? It's what he refuses to critique. I'll use Phil Johnson and Todd Friel's own argument. That's all I'm saying. Nothing new for Lecrae. Here he is partnering with Hillsong Young and Free.
Is it love? If it was, am I living it? Do I live in it?
I'm just going to stop it there because, frankly, I don't want to hear this anymore. This is some of the most worldly garbage you're going to find. There's scarcely an element that differentiates it from the world. Hillsong, Young and Free, is it is Hillsong. All the aberrant doctrines that come out of Hillsong come into their music. And Lecrae standing arm in arm with Hillsong Young and Free, making music with them, going to conferences with them. Here's Lecrae at the Passion Conference a few years ago with Louis Giglio, the Pope Kisser, and Beth Moore, the Southern Baptist Convention darling and heretic embracer. She's friends with Ann Voskamp and Christine Kane. She goes to Joel Osteen's church relatively frequently. Here's what Lecrae does.
Let us pause and be still and ask Jesus to speak to us through his word.
It's called Lectio Divina, mystic, Catholic, contemplative prayer. There's Francis Chan. Full-blown NAR supporter at this point. There's Lecrae. Right, this bizarre silence, this meditative silence it's what's known as Lectio Divina. Let's pause and let God speak his word into our heart. Beth Moore is leading all this nonsense, somebody who's been influenced by Catholic monk brother Lawrence. And here's Lecrae. This is nothing new. This was 2013, 5 years ago he's doing this. Paul Washer has remained conspicuously silent the entire time. For somebody he considers a friend and an honor to be his friend, why has Paul Washer refused to criticize him for this, for all of his doings? It's not just Lecrae and Trip Lee. It's also John Piper On the Heart Cry Missionary Society website, John Piper is recommended no less than 21 times. 21 resources from John Piper listed. And yet, over the years, John Piper has made himself a staple at the very same Passion Conference you just saw Lecrae at. Went on a campaign affirming Rick Warren as theological and doctrinal and sound. And Paul Washer has never once publicly addressed it. Why? Why does he refuse to critique these things? Well, let me tell you what Phil Johnson and Todd Friel said, and I think they're onto something.
And I watched maybe 6 minutes of it, which was way more than I should have spent any time. And I kept waiting for him to come to the point.
I know.
That is not the clip I wanted to play. Sorry.
When I hear him teach, though, and hear some of the things he says and some of the things he refuses to criticize, I think, wow, this guy it's like he's standing at the door of the sheepfold inviting the wolves in, and it drives me crazy.
I agree with you totally in that regard.
He refuses to condemn. He refuses to criticize, and as such, he is effectively welcoming error in the sheepfold, welcoming enemies in. Is John Piper an enemy? No question at this point. Out of Phil Johnson's own mouth in the last presentation, he says, well, John Piper has made himself a staple at the Passion Conference, and, he's not a totally safe bet. He tried to downplay it a little bit because my argument was, why is John MacArthur continuing to partner with John Piper at the Together for the Gospel conferences? It's the exact same argument. My argument is no different from theirs. It's only applied to them. This is what hypocrisy looks like. This is what the modern-day Pharisee looks like. But people don't like hearing that. Because, let's let Todd Friel speak one more time, and he makes a very succinct and ironically prophetic statement.
Okay, why is he like that? Because he defends the worst of the worst by basically pulling the card. Well, I don't listen to all their sermons. I'm not supposed. I wrote a book about it that had no teeth, that didn't name names, and then he embraces the very people that he's supposedly criticizing, like Joseph Prince. And so I tried to figure out what it was. So here's as best I can tell with Michael, that he's got just a gaping blind spot regarding his movement. That it's just he couldn't criticize it because of his relationship to it, his relationships with those people that I'm sure that he loves, and he's just blind in that area of discernment. Is that a possibility?
It is, but I think in his case you have to say it's a willful blindness. It's not as if he's never. I mean, the classic thing was.
It's a willful blindness. He's got personal relationships on the line. He doesn't want to jeopardize those, as do Todd and Phil. They are too closely aligned with, again, they got a business to maintain here, all right? Where do you think J.D. Hall learned his merchandising tactics and buy a John Calvin T-shirt here? He's learning from the big boys, right? If J.D. Hall could have a study Bible with his name stamped on it, I'm sure he would. Probably nobody wants to read it. Anyway, this is what you're dealing with. You're dealing with hypocrisy of the highest caliber. You're seeing them conflict with themselves. This has nothing to do with me. You're watching them pitted against themselves. The update with Paul Washer, this applies to all of them, but this is concerning. These are your friends. These are people you endorse. He has endorsed John Piper on numerous occasions over the years. Never once has he repudiated that endorsement in the face of all of John Piper's illicit activity, in the face of all of John Piper's partnering with Jesus culture, Hillsong, the Passion Movement, all of these people, Carl Lentz, he's friends with Carl Lentz. Absolutely ridiculous. Apostate is the only word I can think of. John Piper has been trending that way for almost a decade at this point. Not once has Paul Washer said anything. Trip Lee and Lecrae have been doing what they're doing for quite some time. If they're your friends, Paul, if it's an honor for them to be friends, for you to be friends with them, do you love them enough to tell them the truth? I've heard you ask this question, Paul. Don't tell me you love somebody if you don't love them enough to tell them the truth. And don't tell me I hate somebody because I love them and everybody listening enough to say this. You think this is making friends? Think I'm making a lot of friends saying this? My objective is not to make enemies. My objective is not to make friends. My objective is to speak the truth. That's the objective. My objective is to ultimately glorify Jesus. My objective is to try to redeem the time that I've been given, because I too will stand and give an account for everything that I said and everything that I didn't say. And I will not stand before God and have him say, you knew to do right in this circumstance and you didn't do it because you feared man, because you feared some practical consequences, because you feared the shame that might be cast upon you, because you feared the so-called excommunication. What's a good thing certain people that even these men respect in the heritage didn't think that way. You got a whole swarm of people known as nonconformist preachers that refused to bow the knee to the Anglican Church in 1662 and were purged from it. People that would include John Owen, and John Bunyan, Philip Doddridge, some pretty prominent men who said, listen, if that's what's going on in this establishment, I'm not going to be a part of it. John Wesley couldn't step foot in a church. They didn't want him in there. Why? Because he wouldn't say what they wanted him to say. What did he do? He took his business to the streets. Let's call John Wesley a sectarian minimalist while we're at it, shall we, Mr. Hall? This is absurd, and I've said this before. I'll say it again. I have offered to publicly debate all of these guys. All of them refused. Line them up, all three, one time. Todd Friel, Phil Johnson, J.D. Hall. I'm not, Phil Johnson called this a braggadocious taunt. No, you guys selectively address questions that weren't even asked. You erect straw man arguments that nobody can hold your feet to the fire on in the moment. All three of you, one time, equal speaking time, videotaped, free distribution. Name the place. I'm not saying anything that I can't defend, and I'm not challenging. I'm not offering a debate challenge because I think I'm particularly clever. I think that the facts speak for themselves, and anybody who's willing to speak truth could say exactly this. Anybody could say this. This is a matter of evidence and listening to what you said one day and what you said the next day and what you refused to say. You guys are a bunch of hypocrites. It's sad. It's sad that people, what did Jesus tell the Pharisees? You travel land and sea to make one proselyte, and when you do, you make him twice as much a son of hell as yourself. You should see the comments that come in from some of the people that are blindly following the MacArthur camp. Oh, you're demonic. You're just a scumbag. Blah blah blah. This is it's just diarrhea mouth, because they have nothing to say. If laws were different, I suspect there would be stones in those hands. Nothing different is coming my way than came the way of anybody who spoke truth in the past. John the Baptist, Stephen, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Jesus himself. You speak truth to people in unwavering terms, and it's a matter of time before hate comes your way. But I'll tell you what, I'm not scared of that, not because I'm tough or whatever, but I'll tell you what, I'm scared of God. I fear God, and I'm commanded to do so. What can you do? The best you can do is the worst thing that can happen to you speaking truth, and this is an admonition for people listening. The worst thing that can happen is somebody kills you and takes your life. Don't fear that person who after that can't do anything else. You're going to stand and give an account for your actions and your inactions one day before a righteous and a holy God. I don't know about you, but that's a terrifying thought. That's an awesome thought. If John the apostle, who lived with Jesus and walked with him for 3 years' time, the disciple whom Jesus loved and laid his head upon his breast, saw him in glory and fell down at his feet as a dead man, what do you think you're going to do? I challenge everybody to think about that. I'm not saying this because it's fun to say controversial things. I'm saying it because there's a problem. People are learning actions that are wrong. They are learning hypocritical actions. They are learning the leaven of the Pharisees. Congratulations, you can parrot a book. Look what you're doing. Look what you're doing by leading somebody astray, saying it's okay to partner with this person and this person. Have you no regard for holiness? Have you no regard for Scripture? You can't possibly. 2 John 10 is a command. 1 Corinthians 5:11 is a command. Romans 16:17 is a command. 2 Chronicles 19:2 is a description of how God feels about people who partner with his enemies. 1 Samuel 3:13 is a description of how God feels and how he treats people who turn a blind eye to sin when it's in the power of them to thwart it. Think about those things, sola scriptura. The people that I hear the most sola scriptura from appeal to it the least. The people that I hear quote Spurgeon or talk about, they say his name, have the least in common with him. Baffling hypocrites, the lot. There's your update to Paul Washer. There's a lot more to be said, and there's a lot more on the horizon. I'd encourage you to think about these issues. Fact check it. Hate me all you want. I'm just holding up a mirror. You have to look at it, right? Whatever negative attributes there are in me, if everything were negative about me, if I was if I was a pagan, it wouldn't alter the veracity of what I'm saying. What I'm saying, is it true? Until next time, Godspeed and God bless.